Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Mark Moss Show, where we talk about the decentralized revolution, the way the world is changing right before our very eyes, moving from centralization to decentralization. We look at it through the lens of politics, finance, and technology. Of course, that technology is Bitcoin. That's given us the decentralized technology to transition the world. I like to bring to you some education to change the way you think about these things, some of the latest breaking news each and every week, so you're up to date on what's going on. And I try to bring some interesting guests so you don't have to listen to me all the time. And that is exactly what we have for you in store right now. I'm joined in the studio by Pete Rizzo. He is the editor at Bitcoin Magazine, and he's also a contributor to Forbes as well. Anyway, Pete, thanks so much for joining me today.
Mark, awesome to be here. Excited to chat.
Yeah, man, that was so cool. We did the Bitcoin 2022 conference and worked the news desk there. And you hosted the desk. I got to sit on the desk with you. That was super fun. So now we're going to reverse the roles, I guess.
Yeah, role reversal. Love it.
Yeah. So, I talk about the way this world is changing. I talk about it through the lens, like I said, of politics, finance, and technology. The technology, in my opinion, I was on a Spaces the other day, and someone was asking about Ray Dalio's new book and the changing world order, and asked me to comment on what he got right and what he got wrong. And I said, "Man, the book's amazing. He had his whole hedge fund, research team do it, and there's more data in there you could ever see. And I love the book, and everyone should read the book. But in my opinion, there's this glaring omission." Where he talked about from a 250-year political cycle and how democracies rise and fall, empires rise and fall. He talked about the financial markets, long-term debt cycles, 80-year debt cycles, et cetera. But he missed the technology piece. And I'm like, man, all of history, it's technology that changes the world more than anything. Whether it was the stirrup or the gunpowder revolution or the printing press or whatever, right? And so he missed that. And so I like to focus on Bitcoin being that piece that can change the world. Do you see it the same way?
Definitely. I mean, I like to consider myself a bit of a Bitcoin historian for people who follow me on Twitter. And something that I always say is Bitcoin is an invention, right? So we're used to living in this world where we're saturated with technology and this idea of innovation. And really, I love to, just separate those two words for people, right? And innovation, your iPhone 14, that's not what happened with Bitcoin. Bitcoin was an invention. And so, what is that, right? And an invention, to me, as I thought about it in the context of Bitcoin, is really, you're invalidating a law of the world, right? So before Bitcoin existed, it was literally impossible for you to send a electronic peer-to-peer financial transaction. It just did not exist. There was no tools for that to happen, right? Money did not exist in a digital setting, right? We had data transfer, we had the web, we had all these ways which information moved. And with Bitcoin, you have economics in a digital setting. And, that invention, really what we're talking about now is how does that invention impact the world? And right, I think as you talked about, the narrative of history is often, how inventions change cultures, change countries. Even if you go back to America, you're thinking about the Wright brothers, right? Invented flight, right? Before they took off in North Carolina, it was true that man could not fly. It was a technological impossibility, and from the point where they leave the ground, that is inaccurate, right? Like they actually changed the world, and it is possible for men to fly. And I love to draw on that example because people might not know the scientific community for 10 years refused to acknowledge the Wright brothers' achievement of flight, right? So this speaks to kind of the dissonance that real invention causes, right? When you actually invent something, usually what you see is a backlash, an aggression against this, right? This can't be done. It was impossible. And I think Bitcoin right now is very much in that era, right? It is still being fought for. We saw today the White House come out and speak about it, and they're not as technologically literate as they could be on the subject, right? We're in this period where this invention, this change of the world is being priced in, happening in real time, and that's to me what makes it so exciting. But I think you're absolutely right, right? This is something that could change the course of where we're going as a country, where history is going, where people are going.
I love that. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but I talk about it kind of similar, where I talk about the difference of new technologies versus technological revolutions. And so there's a book written that I reference all the time. It's Technological Revolutions in Capital or something like that. And they cover there's basically been 5 technological revolutions. And so there's industrial revolution, steam engines and railways, steel, electricity, oil, automobiles, microprocessors. And they happen about every 50 years. And so the microprocessor came out in 71. It's 1971 plus 50 years is like right now today. And the way I look at it is like the difference between a new technology, you referenced the iPhone. The iPhone was like an improvement. We took a phone and a computer, we put them together. Like, that's cool. Right. But a technological revolution changes the course of humanity, and it drives financial markets. And so, obviously, the Industrial Revolution, we had a machine that could do the work of 5,000 men. It changed the course of humanity. Steam engines, now we can move stuff across continents. Electricity, right? We don't have to go into all that. Automobiles, for all of humanity, people walked and rode horses.
Well,
and now
I'll
we
maybe
have
say one that I love, maybe that you wouldn't think of, is the telegraph. And I love this in the context of Bitcoin, where really prior to digital information being sent at all, people were sending financial markets data via pigeons. Actually, if you ever go back into like the 1700s, how financial markets interoperated between European states, you think of the stock ticker, they were actually writing down trades, putting them on carrier pigeons, and the telegraph is really that 0 to 1, right? So where are you getting you're talking about invention, where's that real step change, right? And the step change in that context with the telegraph is you're going from actually using pack animals to move information to you sending sound on a wire. And I think that's a great one because it just really illustrates just like how dramatic is that leap. Well, it's huge, right? You're really going from just like a whole other paradigm to a new paradigm. And I think that's what's so challenging, I think, about Bitcoin, right, is people aren't used to that change, as you were saying, right? We're used to incremental improvements, like the iPhone 14 comes out yesterday. What's the difference? It's got a nicer camera. It's a little bit faster. That's not an invention, right? It's a small tweak and improvements and innovation, but really not even in the same category.
What about when we have a new invention come out, a new invention or technological revolution, however you want to call it, we don't know what it is. Humans are horrible at imagining the future. And so we try to understand it based off of what we know today. We try to describe it. Well, it's sort of like this, sort of like that. So when electricity was first invented, the killer app was a light bulb. So like, what is this electricity thing? Well, it's sort of like a digital candle. What do we need that for? Candles have been light for 5,000 years. And look, they're portable. It's so much better. And it was that. But it became so much more because it was like a new building block, right? And like steel, what's steel? Well, it's like a harder metal, but we didn't know we'd have a space shuttle one day because of steel. So when I think about that in terms of Bitcoin, you mentioned earlier we didn't have like a digital cash before. And sometimes I think that like always referring to it as money is the first killer application. Like the light bulb was the first killer application. But do you think it can become a lot more just as electricity became more than a digital candle?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because I think what you're talking about here is, going back to the communications example with the telegraph, right? What did the telegraph allow? Well, as soon as you can transport sound by wire, really you think about the hundreds of years that innovation that came off of that. When people talk about the internet, they'll go back to ARPANET. And my question is always like, why stop there? That's actually, ARPANET was you're talking about network computers, which goes back to the computer, which goes back to really what's the core innovation. The core thing is you actually being able to send data in any context across any distance. And really, so, you think about that communications revolution, it was actually a lot longer, right? We've kind of taught ourselves, people are used to the 90s, 2000s, the internet was such a mature technology, it was disrupting all these industries. I think with Bitcoin, that's the future, but we're definitely, we're approaching that, but, it's going to be a journey, right? We're really actually at the early stages of that kind of transition. So what does it look like? I mean, it looks like money and markets, kind of moving at the speed of the internet and with the mobility of the internet, and hopefully with more. And
I was really liking that conversation that we were in, Pete, for a minute. And before the break, we were talking about how because we can't imagine the future as humans, we just imagine better versions of what we have today, because we don't have the building blocks needed to build those new things, right? And so also the way we view things changes. So like one thing I think about the internet, like pre-internet, if people thought about information, you would think probably about the morning newspaper or the nightly news. But today, like a kid in Indonesia could post a picture at the beach, and now there's all this information. I see what the weather's like. I see what the waves are like. I see what the trees are like. You know what I mean? And like the way we think of information has changed. And so back to kind of Bitcoin, like we look at it as money, but I think the 0 to 1 is like this decentralization. And I don't think the whole world everything doesn't need to be decentralized. Money does, right? But almost like maybe the way we view money might change, and maybe it's a different set of building blocks that gives us other things we didn't think of.
Well, certainly Bitcoin, is a technology, right? So people who are new to Bitcoin as a subject matter, right? It is a software. It's an open source software. It's constantly growing and changing. And because of that, there's always people kind of trying to figure out where the edge cases are and how they can push the boundaries of Bitcoin, right? I wrote in one of my recent articles for Forbes that Bitcoin is, theoretically only limited by human invention, right? So one of the exciting things that's going on at the bleeding edge of the development community, they're actually looking at ways to send U.S. dollars or kind of, stable coins, they're called, or, U.S. dollars over the Bitcoin network, right? You're actually kind of taking a certain amount of the data in Bitcoin, a certain amount of bits of Bitcoin, and you're using that to kind of back something like a dollar. And now, you have the decentralization of Bitcoin, right? You kind of have the hardness of the monetary policy at the base layer. But now we're actually kind of inventing kind of the ability to launch new types of applications, right? Where you can have new types of assets that travel on the same network, right? So kind of what you were saying, the thing about Bitcoin is it's a technology. It's being built in layers. It's being built by innovators. And, again, there's different kind of areas where this is emerging, right? The Lightning Network kind of doing the same thing for payments, right? So we're seeing now kind of, Bitcoin was the invention. Satoshi Nakamoto created in 2009. It's become this kind of global sensation for, it being a sound money that people are adopting. And now the developers are kind of pushing the limits of that. Where is that? And I think that's one of the most interesting kind of narratives and fault lines in the industry is, how much more is Bitcoin going to change? How much more are innovators going to push it? And then how much, are Bitcoin holders, going to go along with that process? Are they going to like and use these and support these inventions, or are they going to push back on them? And I think, being someone who watches the space really closely, those are often kind of the month-to-month, year-to-year things that I'm really looking at is, how are these kind of new technologies, these new emerging use cases for Bitcoin performing, and, what kind of data we're getting.
Yeah, you recently put an article on Forbes about how to be a Bitcoin maximalist, which I want to dig into. But before we get there, something that you were just kind of saying. So you're talking about some of this development, and a lot of times, one of the biggest pieces of FUD or whatever that objections that we'd hear to Bitcoin is it's old technology, right? But yet we find out it's constantly new things are being built on top of it. One of the things you alluded to, I think, was like this new Taro upgrade that's coming, or this new Taro layer 2, where you could have other types of assets being built on top of Bitcoin. And so you could transfer other assets like a stable coin, to your point. And even like potentially, if we can get rid of the laws in the way, like could be like equities, like stock certificates, for example. And I think about like pre-internet days, when you used to have stock, you would actually get a stock certificate. It would be a bearer instrument. And then I could give you that bearer instrument, and then you would have it. And then custody is who has it, and you could almost have like a stock being back to like a bearer instrument and trade across like that Taro network. Now, it's back to a bearer instrument, and I guess at the end of the day, the company that issued the stock could cancel it or whatever. But at least I have that bearer instrument. A lot of people in the Bitcoin space, though, seem to think that any other asset besides Bitcoin is, I don't want to say the word on radio, but is a scam or whatever, right? And it's like, but so anyway, what's your overall thought on that?
Well, I think this is one of the great tensions and dramas of the space, right? I think obviously, Bitcoin is an exciting technology, but again, like we're talking about kind of where are the limits, right? And I think one of the fascinating things about people who are even hardcore Bitcoiners, we call them Bitcoin maximalists, is, they don't live the entirety of their financial lives currently on Bitcoin, right? So many of them, I joked on a recent podcast that, I went to a conference that weekend and it sure looked like everybody was using Uber, right? So this is an application that does not accept Bitcoin as a payment method. They're not plugged into the new financial rails, right? So there is this disconnect, and that's sort of why I said, yes, Bitcoin is this invention. Yes, theoretically, there are no bounds for Bitcoin, right? I think one of the tenets of Bitcoin maximalism is that Bitcoin is only limited by human invention, but I think Bitcoin is also a consensus system, and this is a really hard concept, I think, for new people to kind of understand, which is that Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer network, right? So when you run the Bitcoin software, when you actually join it, you are a node on the network. You are, an operator that is equal to to everyone else, and that's a very interesting architecture because what it requires is that the upgrades then kind of take place in a way where that architecture is respected without creating any hierarchy, right? So you mentioned kind of the other cryptocurrencies. Why are people more bearish on those? Well, it's precisely because they traffic in these kind of hierarchies, right? They kind of move away from this peer-to-peer structure, this decentralization that you're talking about, into something else, right? Where there's kind of a built-in hierarchy, or they'll kind of say that they're adding features or they're adding specialization, but they're moving away from the data structure that Bitcoin has, and I think. But that said, Bitcoiners or people who are using Bitcoin, we do have to support and further these different networks on top of Bitcoin if we want them to continue. So, I wrote this piece on Bitcoin Maximalism, which I think laid out, what I consider the principles of Bitcoin. And I think one of them is this idea that, we should want to continue to advance Bitcoin, right? We should want to continue to bring ideas that we see elsewhere and bring them into the Bitcoin economy. But, again, this is a consensus system, right? So some people like the fact that Bitcoin is hard money. They like the fact that it's censorship resistant. They like the fact that no one can seize it. And they like the fact that because, as the number of users goes up, their Bitcoin is going to become more valuable, right? So in some ways, these people are a bit disincentivized from these new things, right? So there is this natural tension, right? And as a storyteller or somebody who is, more of a journalist, I think one of the more fascinating subjects in the space is really this fault line, right? If it is true, Bitcoin can expand to do all these things, and if, we are the ones who are essentially limiting it, how far will we want to push it? And, I think you're alluding to it's that, there's a group of people who I think, they like what Bitcoin is today.
Let's take a break right there. And Pete, right before the break, before we almost ran out of time, you were talking about how Bitcoin and these Bitcoin maximalists and like it because of certain features it has. And so to me, I think about that, right? Like I think I like Bitcoin. I think to me, the revolution or the invention, in your words, is we have technology that's decentralized, so nobody controls it. It's permissionless, etc. And it's censorship resistant. So now I can hold something that can't be manipulated and nobody can seize it or steal it from me. But then that's just a set of building blocks. If I had a deck of cards, I can build like a teepee or like a house of cards. But if I have a set of Legos, I can build way different things. And so now we have this new building block. We can build all types of things. But the one, and I want to protect that. And that's why, to me, Bitcoin is the only, we like to say, Bitcoin, not cryptocurrency. None of the other cryptocurrencies really have that same level of decentralization or censorship resistance that we have with Bitcoin. You were talking about like some of these upgrades that happen. And so like with other ones like Ethereum, for example, they're going to upgrade the network and everyone is forced into that upgrade. Whereas like with Bitcoin, when they put upgrades into it, those are soft forks and you're not forced to run that new line of code. You could still operate without that. So I think that's one big difference there.
I think, I'll riff off of that. I think the fact that Bitcoin is a software economy and a digital economy in which, you as the user are it's designed in such a way where you can consent into these agreements, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head. Ethereum going through a big upgrade coming up, and the reality of that is, whatever kind of new features or upgrades they're promising, at the point that they launch that new software, that is Ethereum, right? You have to be running that software, and if you are not, you effectively don't exist from the network, right? Anything that you might have invested in, if you don't go along with that upgrade, again, you don't really exist. So again, I think the Bitcoin view is that this kind of amounts to, essentially coercion, right? The developers are kind of putting something forward, ostensibly in the best interests of users. But Bitcoin kind of confronted this moral crisis earlier on and essentially took, what I thought was, the longer road and the more legitimate road. And it's kind of one of the key building blocks of why I became someone who was aligned to Bitcoin, because I originally kind of came to the whole industry, as a journalist, of somebody who was skeptical, right, who's kind of maintained an objective lens. I think when I saw that, that was a big, differentiator to me, right? It was, okay, well, not only do we have this technological capability, but we're actually going to ask kind of deep philosophical and moral questions and kind of bake that into the foundational layer of Bitcoin, right? But there is a trade-off, right? So the trade-off is that, if you want those more advanced technical things, like, you were saying, trading of kind of stocks or kind of equity type assets, those do exist in other cryptocurrencies today, right? They just exist in such a way where you could say that those users do not have the same level of freedom. They don't have the same level of rights, I guess, within that protocol. And I think for people who are Bitcoiners, people who support the idea that we should want economies in the future to be free from that coercion, they look very skeptically at these models, right? So I'll just say one more thing from the article. Kind of said, here are the principles of Bitcoin maximalism, and first and foremost was a commitment to safeguarding Bitcoin for future generations. This is something that I think a lot of people who are new to Bitcoin, even the crypto world, it takes them so long to grok. There is this understanding in Bitcoin among the Bitcoin developers that the Bitcoin software is going to be run in 100 years' time. That we expect the people who are operating and running the Bitcoin software today will still be able to access that in the future. The other cryptocurrencies, they take a dramatically different approach. Something like the merge with Ethereum, you don't know that the technology is going to be live tomorrow, right? So it speaks to a values disagreement. I think partly what I was trying to achieve in writing this piece is that, I think Bitcoiners, especially people who are new and maybe don't understand this value set, I think they'll, maybe kind of be more defensive about these things. And I say, as somebody who's kind of come to the Bitcoin perspective, this is just a principled objection, right? There's just no scenario in which Bitcoin would ever be kind of facing this situation, because our North Star, the Bitcoin North Star, right? We can't assume who is going to use Bitcoin and for what purpose, the extremity of their situation. You're kidnapped, you're in a coma, whatever. You want access to your money, right? So Bitcoin treats the design of its protocol, the availability of its software, with that level of scrutiny, right? The other cryptocurrencies don't. So full stop, even just off the bat, no matter what they're adding in terms of technical complexity, there is a value misalignment where, I can say, as somebody who keeps the majority of their value and their wealth within Bitcoin, I wouldn't support a protocol that was making those decisions. And I think, it's important that when we talk about these, decisions, that we talk about it from a principle first standpoint, because I think otherwise we end up kind of looking negative. We end up looking like we're rooting for these things to fail. And, I don't come at it from that perspective. I just say, these are Bitcoin's principles. These are kind of the people who I know, like these are the values that they've told me. And, you can look at these values and then you can look at what these other protocols are doing, and you should be able to see the disconnect.
Yeah, I would agree 100% on that. I mean, what I think one big thing, so you talk about safeguarding Bitcoin for future generations. When I think about Bitcoin maximalism, I think about trying to keep the message pure. And I think so many people are blind because they're chasing money. And what do you mean Cardano's a scam? Look how much money I made. Oh, okay, so as an investment, it worked. I mean, people make money in Ponzi's all the time. But they look at it from that lens, and I think it blinds them to the actual invention that's going on right now.
Yeah, this was the one, as a journalist who is trying to be objective, I think this is one of the things that I encourage other journalists to look at, right? And I try to get them to look at this on the face value. And the example you just explained, right? You're having people who are investing in something that is pretending to be a new currency, and they're telling you that they think it is useful because it's worth more in dollars to them. Right. And you should be able to see the logical contradiction in that line of thinking. Right. And that was something that stuck out to me very early on in dealing with the Bitcoin developers, against who came at it from this principled approach, is that they never asked that. They were never valuing Bitcoin in those terms. Even, you talk about the memes and the culture around Bitcoin and the number go up. The people who were safeguarding the protocol, that's not how they behaved. They behaved as if, Bitcoin was the most important thing. Safeguarding it for the future was most important. They knew that it was going to be more valuable in the future. And so they took it from that approach.
Yeah, and I would say you really see that more and more with the Bitcoin maximalists. So people that would self-identify with that, I have a hard time with labels, but I mean, I guess I would put myself in that camp for a couple of reasons. One, to your point about ideologies, the old cliche: if you stand for nothing, you fall for anything. So it's like they're very principled. But the other thing is something that I've been actually we talked to Alex Jones about, and I've been kind of something I pound the table on all the time is the need to build these parallel economies. That's really, I think, when I study history, that's really how the USSR came down. Everybody left the main economies to build parallel economies. When it collapsed, it cushioned the blow because now there's these black markets set up. And I think we can do that, but we can set up different education systems, media systems, food systems, health systems, but we need a payment technology that allows us to do that. So Bitcoin enables all of that. Without the freedom of payments, there's no freedom. And so if you look at Bitcoin as a parallel monetary system and forget trying to measure it in dollars all the time, and I think most of the people that would probably identify as Bitcoin maximalists have kind of made that leap forward. And whether Bitcoin's 68,000 US dollars or 8,000 US dollars, the censorship resistant payment technology still works. Anyway, you're listening to the Mark Moss Show. We're talking about the decentralized revolution each and every week. We look at it through the lens of politics, finance, and technology. Today, we're really hitting on the technology, which, of course, is Bitcoin. I'm in the studio with Pete Rizzo. He is the editor at Bitcoin Magazine, contributor at Forbes as well. He just put out an article on Forbes, and it's titled How to Be a Bitcoin Maximalist. And we're digging into that. What does that mean? Talking about safeguarding it, you had mentioned earlier what the White House was talking about today and this new Biden's executive order on energy. And man, they really want to be coming for proof of work, it seems like, right. Which, of course, is directly an attack on Bitcoin. And so do you think, to point number one, safeguarding Bitcoin, like Bitcoin maximalists would be the ones then going and kind of trying to educate politicians and challenge that, try to uphold that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I put as one of the principles, is upholding, advocating for Bitcoin mining by any and all means, right? So people who are Bitcoin maximalists to me, right, they're people who are going to, essentially understand that proof of work is essential to the operation of the Bitcoin network, right? We know of no alternatives, that can concurrently, operate an economy in the way that proof of work allows, right? It's the only consensus method that exists by which anyone, in the world, can, compete for the new currency issuance within that economy in a free market where there isn't barriers to entry imposed by any other group. And I think this is one of the biggest differentiations, especially as the White House looks at this, and I hope they explore more, is essentially, if you look at kind of the other approaches within cryptocurrency or even in fiat economies, right, essentially, access to new money printing, there's always some barrier set by someone, right? In the fiat system, essentially the banks are printing money, and they're being sent to banks to be issued as loans to consumers, right? That is how new money enters that economy. In the kind of other new cryptocurrency networks, often they're kind of setting a barrier where within the protocol itself, so within the actual software, you need to hold a certain amount of the currency. You need to have a certain amount of capital, to be able to compete or to be able to kind of win a share of this new issuance. So again, kind of going back to kind of square one, the Bitcoin maximalist, the person who comes at it from a Bitcoin perspective, they're going to advocate for the system, whereby anyone anywhere in the world who's capable of generating electricity and powering that and adding that to the Bitcoin network can compete for the issuance, right? That's the breakthrough here, right? There just isn't another system by which you can potentially distribute new money in an economy into anyone in the world, anywhere, without knowing anything about them, without restricting them in any way. So I think people focus on the energy component when really that's the wrong way to look at it. The right way to look at it is through this lens of, what kind of economy do you want to have? Do you want to have an economy where some people are advantaged? Or do you want to have an economy where everyone can compete? Everyone has the ability to. You might be saying, oh, well, hey, I don't mine Bitcoin. But look, the reality is you can. You could go out and buy a mining machine, buy a mining rig, plug it in. And the price that you pay for that miner and the price that you pay for that electricity, both of those factors are going to be set by the market. Just people buying and selling goods within the market. right? In every other instance where you would try to do that in an economy, that same structure does not work. You're going to go out and buy another mining rig for another type of cryptocurrency. Well, good luck. There might be a set of rules or barriers imposed on you by that protocol. So again, I think they're fundamentally different types of systems. And with proof of work, I always think it goes back to the distribution, right? And people, I think, in Bitcoin, they like to draw this connotation with work and fairness. And if you're the one who's able to do the work, you should be able to reap the rewards. And that couldn't contrast more with the kind of capitalist system we have right now, whereas it is your proximity to the institutions that determines your ability to get the new issuance within the economy.
Yeah. The more that we talk through this, the more I just kind of keep going back to the difference of a Bitcoin maximalist versus a crypto enthusiast is just the ideology. I just kind of keep going back to that, right? Like I get all these different emails in my inbox every day, and I constantly get these ones like, oh, the next Bitcoin, I'm selling all my Bitcoin because I found this next one that's going to do better for me. But they all approach it from an investment angle. They're all trying to approach these other cryptocurrencies as to how much money they can make. I went to Consensus in Austin this year. I didn't actually attend the event, but I was in Austin and I went to some of the after events and whatnot. And when you're at a Bitcoin event, like everybody's there is like freedom minded. They're there for, censorship resistant, these types of things. And I was at this after event and I'm like looking around at all these people. I'm like, who are all these people? And like, why are they here? And I decided I was going to ask a couple of them, and I was like, what do you think is like, what's the most technologically advanced thing that you saw here? And someone's like, oh, well, one guy asked, he said, we could do deeds. I'm like, what do you mean deeds? He's like, well, I could put my mortgage on a blockchain.
Right,
I was like, okay. And then like another person is like, oh, well, video games. I'm like, do video games need to be like censorship resistant? You know what I mean? And so it's really that ideology.
Well, I think for me as a journalist coming into the space, and I try to use this experience as like we were so overwhelmingly biased and encouraged towards a bias. We were looking at it as a frame through technology. So you mentioned Consensus. I happen to be one of the original journalists over at CoinDesk, and really even just the founding mission of CoinDesk, which puts on the Consensus conference, was essentially like be TechCrunch for Bitcoin. That was essentially kind of the motto. There was this idea that, we were covering kind of this exciting new technology. This technology was going to do all these things. It was about startups. It was about growth. It was kind of applying these old ideologies to Bitcoin, and people totally missed the values conversation, right? And I think that's why Bitcoin maximalism really always appealed to me, is because I was somebody who was the same vortex you're talking about of these, gross cryptocurrency conferences where there's investors kind of shilling this or that and founders shilling this or that. I became very disconnected with this. And, you think about, what are journalists trying to do? Ultimately, journalists are people who are biased towards trying to inform the public for the greater good, right? And essentially, once I understood Bitcoin and the value system that it had, and of course, that took a great deal of, my own kind of personal time and attention to kind of tease this out, right? I think a lot of people who are coming to the industry today, it's a lot easier for you to understand why Bitcoin is a different value system than the other cryptocurrencies. It wasn't always the case, right? But again, for me, it was kind of really trying to dig in there. And often you see that the value system within these other cryptocurrencies is, oh, well, I just want to build the next big app. I want to have the big next startup. I want to have the next big thing that exits, right? There isn't an actual fundamental, value there. Whereas with the Bitcoin maximalists that I remember, the old developers, talking to the core developers, I remember there's a famous Bitcoin developer. I only had a chance to ask him one question. I only met him one time, Greg Maxwell. He's probably one of the most legendary developers. And I asked him, I said, hey, does it matter to you if Bitcoin succeeds within your lifetime, right? And what I was really trying to get forward with that question was, this was kind of at a time of upheaval and uncertainty and kind of change in the industry. And he just said one word answer was just no, right? He basically looked at me and said, and it told me everything that I think I was looking for that answer. I wanted someone to kind of affirm kind of what I knew already, but in that moment, I think what I got from that interaction was essentially, oh, this is an individual who really understands and is so committed to kind of the bedrock ideology of this. We need a non-state money system. This is something that's so worthy of being created that, any sacrifice is worth it in order to ensure that this creation, this invention, reaches its full potential. And it's such an powerful and important moment for me, I think.
Yeah. What a good point that you make. And, you look back at some of the greatest things that have been built in the world, from the pyramids to the castles, cathedrals. Those things could take 2, 3, 4, 500 years, which could span multiple generations of people who would never see their work completed. And so as we continue to build that time preference where we want to work to those higher value things like Bitcoin, maybe we can return to that period of greatness again. And I think as you come into Bitcoin, eventually the ideology will change you, and it starts to change all areas of your life. We see that over and over. You've been listening to the Mark Moss Show. We talk about the decentralized revolution, the way the world is changing before our very eyes through the lens of politics, finance, and technology. I'm in the studio with Pete Rizzo. Give him a follow on Twitter at Pete_Rizzo_, and check him out at Bitcoin Magazine and Forbes. That's what we got. Thanks for listening. Since you've stayed to the end, I know you like this video, which means you're probably going to really like this video right here and this video right here.